It is that time to once again go over the latest top 8 result from the SCG. This time it's going to be another team standard we're going to have a look at. But before we get started, I'm also going to highlight this Merfolk deck that actually played in the team format and came on place number 12. Obviously it's nothing too interesting when it comes to the creature cards, they are the good Merfolk creatures, but it's kind of fun to highlight a different tribe, although to be fair, most people who play MTG Arena don't really have anything fond to say about Merfolks. Especially new players, that's pretty much gonna be their most hated deck to play against. Probably Merfolk and Vampires, I would imagine. But anyway, here is the list. It's nothing too interesting, as I said, but it is still, it works. It worked in a tournament. Now, there's one thing I want to mention before we go into the top 8, and that is you can see decks like these coming into tournament and sometimes doing well, but then you never see them again. So just because this one actually came 12th in a team open doesn't mean that it's now going to become a standard deck and that Merfolk is now going to be tier 1. Again, you can always have that one lucky streak and take a deck that shouldn't really work and somehow squeeze out wins. So just because this deck works doesn't mean it's like a tier 1. Again, if it shows up next week and a week after and finish 1, 2, then we can start talking about Merfolk for reals. Anyway, let's move on to the top 8, and I'm just gonna make sure that I'm actually recording. Yes, I am actually recording. Alright, that would have been a bit annoying if I didn't. Anyway, let's move on, and we're gonna start at place number 8, and it's gonna be the Temur Reclamation. Or Temur Reclamation? I don't know. This is a completely new take on Wilderness Reclamation that has started popping up. This one does not use everyone's hate card Nexus of Fate. Instead, you still have Wilderness Reclamation, but you have creatures such as Niv Miss here, and of course you have, the standard really good cards when it comes to Nexus of Fate decks. You can see draw power, board clear, there's nothing really here to talk about. You should know what this deck is trying to do. Resolve the Reclamation, draw a bunch of cards, do a lot of unfair stuff, stick a Niv Mizzet on the board, and hopefully Niv can carry the game. In the sideboard we can find the Ooze, we can find 3 copies of the Rekindling Phoenix, and a few more spot removals and a bit more board clear, as well as some negates. But nothing really to get excited about. The R2 Star of Extinction, we haven't seen this card for several months now. Basically, once the new control decks came out and they no longer play red, we kind of saw Star of Extinction getting extinct. Yeah, that was really forced. Anyway, this deck is quite straightforward, came number 8, and I don't know, this looks like it could be quite fun. Obviously it's not as frustrating as Nexus of Fate. Let's move on, and let's move on to the Azorius Aggro. Now basically I prefer calling this mono white pre-board. Post-board it's blue-white, but as you can see, before you board with the sideboard, the cards are just your standard good white creatures. You have the Vanguard, you have the Loxodon. The cards that tends to shift in this deck is the number of Vanguards, and that tends to be it. Also the Deputy Detention, sometimes you can see 1 in the main board and 1 in the sideboard. But apart from that, they are pretty much all the same. You have the Legion's Landing, the History of Benalia, etc, etc. And of course in the sideboard you find the reason why this deck is white-blue. You have a lot of counter spells. Well, not a lot of them, but you have a few. Another card that's kind of varies in numbers and where it is in this deck is of course Ajani, Adversary of Tyrants. In this version we can see 3 in the sideboards. Sometimes you see 1 in the main board and 1 in the sideboard. Sometimes you have 2 in the main board, etc, etc. It doesn't really matter, it's up to personal preference and what you feel is actually working. Let's talk a little bit about the deck for just a moment. Obviously the deck is very good. It can do a lot of unfair stuff, but so can many standard decks. Now, one of the problems the deck has is reach, and it can also run out of tempo, because you don't have any draw powers. If they remove everything on your board, you're basically playing top deck. And also because everything you have is creature damage, you can't lightning bolt or shock them for that last point of damage. So if you ever stumble, the deck can really work against you. You don't really get a second chance with Azorius aggro unless you already had something like a Legion's Landing transformed already. The deck is, the deck is good, and of course I can also recommend it, but the deck is not, it's very straightforward, and basically if you stumble hard. Here we can see the second Azorius aggro, and this one came on place number 6, and as we can see, it's pretty much the same. This version you have 1 Ajani in the main board and 2 in the sideboard. We can find 3 Vanguards and a bit different numbers of the Taker. But other than that, again, the decks are very similar. I mean, it is the same deck, just a bit different of how many copies you include. It's all up to person preference. You can copy either of these and do well. Although if you play MTG Arena and play best of ones, I would go for a mono white deck and not bother going with Azorius aggro, because obviously you're not going to have a game number 2 and 3 where you get the sideboard in your counterspells. So in that case, you actually don't have anything blue in your main board. So yeah, if you're playing best of ones, just pretty much copy the list, but take out the blue mana and put in the white mana, and that's about it, and you will do fine. Anyway, let's move on to our first control deck, and we're gonna have a look at Esper Control. Now, as we always do when it comes to control decks, we're pretty much gonna skip this. We know what the deck wants to do. It wants to eventually win through Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and that's about it. You have a bunch of spot removals, you have a few counterspells, and there's nothing really to say about it. Obviously, you still need to play the deck correctly and make the right decisions when you play the deck, but you can't really talk about the lists when it comes to control decks because they're all pretty much the same. It's just how many counterspells and how many spot removals you choose to include. Obviously, you do need at least 3 Teferi Hero of Dominaria to even play the deck, because without it, well, you're not really gonna win. You're just gonna deck yourself. So yeah, again, if you want to play control, this is the go-to control deck. You can pretty much copy the list and just play with the number of cards you want to include, and that's about it. Of course, the one new card in this particular list is a single copy of Kaya, but there's nothing really to talk about. The card is obviously really good. Now, there's one thing she does that is quite important that I could talk about, and that is her second ability. We'll be able to exile target creature with converted mana cost of 1, which means it's actually a really good card against mono blue, assuming you get to resolve it. Although, in most cases against mono blue, you're just gonna play Kaya and get its spell pierce to get rid of a spell pierce. That's about it. Anyway, let's move on to the next deck, and on place number 4, we're gonna find Gruul Aggro. Now, we have seen a few Gruul decks popping up, but they all tend to include different things. Some of them go with a very riot-focused game plan. This particular one doesn't have that many riot to creatures. It has the Spellbreaker, but it doesn't have the 2/2 Goblin that also have riot to, which is also good. Now, I'm suspecting, well, I know that right now Gruul Aggro is trying to find its place. Like, people are experimenting with different lists, and what we see here is probably not what's gonna be the best Gruul Aggro list in the coming months. So, I don't know. You could copy this list and do well. The deck is good, but the deck is gonna evolve over time, so you can't really say like that this is the end game. This is not like Mono Blue where the deck is pretty much figured out, or like any of the old school tier 1 decks that are pretty much figured out, and I don't think people really do is mess with the numbers, and that's about it. Anyway, we can have a quick look at the deck. We can find the Daredevil. Goblin Chainwhirl is of course always a good card. Growth Chamber Guardian, again an amazing card, which is finally seeing more play. This card did see a lot of play the first week after the expansion came out, but since then we haven't seen that many Growth Chamber Guardians. Obviously, Gruul Spellbreaker is amazing. We have 2 Harpooner here. We have the Rekindling Phoenix and the Hellkite. Let's move on. So I want to talk a little bit about Karn. Now, it's kind of interesting that this particular list went with Karn in the main board and with the Chaosbringer in the sideboard. Usually, I would think you would want like the explosive start in game number 1 and really take over and dominate with your creatures in game number 1. Again, Karn is not a bad card, but I don't know, in a creature deck like this, without going into a long explanation, I would just simply expect Chaosbringer to be in the main board and Karn to be a sideboard card. Obviously, you do want Karn in a longer game where you're actually going to need to draw cards, because outside of Karn you don't really have any card draw. This tends to always be the issue with any creature heavy deck. They just tend to never really have a card draw, and obviously Karn is a really good solution to that in game number 2 and 3. However, in this particular list he did choose to put the Karn in the main board. Obviously, either version could work. You could have Karn in the sideboard and the Chaosbringer in the main board, but I was giving my opinion. Anyway, you can certainly take this deck and do well. Let's move on to place number 3, and here we're gonna find the token deck. Now, previously to this, we haven't really seen the token deck since like the first week of the new expansion or the new set. Basically, the amount of board clear completely chased the token deck away. However, the recent week we're actually seeing a lot of token decks creeping up. Obviously, the deck is good, but it has that problem if you hit it with a board removal, or if you have something that can deal either 1 damage or 2 damage depending on the board state, the deck just falls apart. You don't have any card draw engine really. Like, you could always include Karn, but let's say you have Karn in a deck. Okay, when you're gonna play it, you want all your creatures out as soon as possible to make a huge March of the Multitude and to get good value from your Dryad. But if you're gonna try to play Karn, you are gonna have to stop to either play the Karn or basically hold the Karn and watch all your stuff be removed and then play the Karn. And sure, you get to draw 2 cards, but you have no more board, and the token decks kind of relies upon you having creatures on the board. It's very hard to make it work like when you don't have a massive board, and that is always going to be the weakness of the token deck. Now, there was a interesting moment during the stream when the token deck went up against the mono red deck, or red deck wins, and managed to resolve 4 Hysteropenalia in consecutive turns. That was really tilting, but somehow the red deck wins was able to actually deal with that situation for a real long time. It was quite a interesting game, really. I do think it was the semi-final if you want to go and watch that particular history. But overall, the token deck hasn't really changed that much since the last time we saw it. The new inclusions in the deck are the flower. No wait, the flower was there before. Excuse me, I remember incorrectly. The new additions is simply the Titter Taker and the 2 copies of the Radiant Champion, which is a card I never thought I would see in high level play ever. Here's the thing. You can always say like, oh, but that card was played in a top 8 list, so it must be good. Here's the thing. Maybe they're just trying it out. Maybe that card was not the reason they actually won. For example, certain mono blue decks are still trying to include a single copy of the 3-mana Jace, and again, the deck is gonna do well with or without that single copy of the Jace in the sideboard or in the main board. So it's not really gonna be the reason because you're winning. That is why I really dislike when people are hyping up a card just because it won or just because it placed well in a single tournament. It could just be that they decided maybe this card could work, but it didn't actually have any impact on any of the games they played. So again, I'm not gonna say that you should go out and craft the Radiant Champion right now if you want to play a token deck, but you could certainly keep an eye upon the card to see if it is a card that's going to be played in the coming weeks and actually become a staple card in the new version of the token deck. But other than that, there's nothing really to talk about. The list is otherwise pretty much the same. The sideboard, we do find 4 copies of the Harpooner. Again, this card is seen everywhere, and of course it is mainly there to deal with mono blue, but it can also deal with Izzet Drakes. Although in this particular tournament I did not see that many Drakes. I'm guessing the Harpooners are to a certain degree scaring off the Drake decks for now in Standard, but make no mistakes, the Drakes are gonna come back at some point, and probably the Phoenixes as well. Again, the deck is not like, you can't play every single deck in every single tournament. Anyway, let's move on to the second place, and here we're gonna find Red Deck Wins. Now, when it comes to the red deck wins, there's not much to talk about. The creatures are pretty much the same in every single version. The spells may vary a little bit. For example, I'm gonna spoil it right now. The first place deck is also gonna be mono red deck, and as we can see, the list is pretty much the same. The main difference in the main board here is gonna be this one runs 2 Experimental Frenzy and 2 Risk Factor, while this one runs 4 Experimental Frenzy. Other than that, red deck wins is always going to be a good deck. There's not much to really talk about. There is one thing I want to talk about that is not really about the creatures or the deck, but it's more about how the deck actually plays and why the deck tends to become better in a later expansion or in a later standard environment. Mainly because the later you go in standards, you tend to actually eventually get the triple color decks. And the problem with a triple color deck is if you ever stumble against a red deck wins, you are pretty much gonna lose the game from that point. It's very hard for a deck that needs to resolve every single land in the right order to come back from any kind of stumble against something so aggressive against red deck wins, especially when a single shock, a single lightning strike can end the game late on, even if the other deck has managed to establish an impressive board and has a huge drake or whatever. You're always running that risk against red deck wins that any card could end you. And of course, right now in standard, we do have Experimental Frenzy in mono red decks. And this card is, of course, it is an amazing card. I don't know, I made a video about it before. Honestly, I hate the card, I hate everything it does, but obviously the card is really good. It gives red so much reach, and I don't know. Personally, I would love to see it banned, but probably not gonna happen. The card is just, I don't know, it's problematic. You can do everything right against the mono red deck. You can make every right trade, every right decision, and then they play Experimental Frenzy and you lose because they get shock, or bolt. Again, I just don't like how extremely RNG heavy the card is and how extremely oppressive it is. Again, I don't know. Anyway, I'm not gonna talk anymore about Experimental Frenzy. I already made a video about it, so if you do want more in-depth thoughts, go and watch that particular video. It was quite a while ago though, so you're gonna have to go back quite a while. Anyway, let's have a quick look at the sideboards. Here we're gonna find Treasure Map, we're gonna find a single copy of the Dire Fleet Daredevil. Obviously the Lightning Mare is an amazing card when there are mono blue decks out there, because it can't be countered, which is very important, and of course it cannot be blocked by a blue card, so you can pretty much play a aggro race against mono blue, like whoever kills whoever first pretty much wins. I don't know, the card is obviously good against mono blue and that's why it's here. You have a single copy of the Cannonade just for more board removals, and of course that one Banefire that you always should have in the sideboard when it comes to any red deck, because eventually you are gonna win a game because you did have that one Banefire. 2 Fight with Fire, and of course we are gonna see the Lava Coils in the sideboard. Again, Lava Coil, as long as mono blue is as strong as it is, you cannot risk running Lava Coil in the main board. Even though you can meet Izzet Drake sticks, it's more important to have things like Shock, Lightning Strike that can actually threaten the mono blue creatures on their turn. Lava Coil you can always swap in when you go for post-board games. Anyway, let's have a quick look at the mono red deck that actually won the standard or came in first place in the standard. Now do remember that this is a team format, so even if you lost your standard match, if your teammates won the legacy and the modern match, you still won. So, it's kind of hard to judge a team open as a be end of all when it comes to decks, because things could, you could actually be carried in that particular game by your teammates. Anyway, let's have a quick look at the sideboard before we end this video. Here we're gonna find 3 Legion Warboss. I do find this a bit interesting because Warboss is not that good against Control right now, mainly because Control runs so many spot removals and so many board clears, it's kind of hard to actually get a good value out of it. Cards like Legion Warboss are amazing when Control rely solely upon countering your stuff and only have a few spot removals. But right now, I don't know, most control decks have like 10, 12 spot removals or board clears, which makes Legion Warboss a lot less desired. Again, the card saw a lot more play before we had the shift into black when it comes to control decks. Anyway, the really outstanding card in this particular list is gonna be the 1 copy of the Jaya Balrog. Now, as I said earlier, when it anyway, let's move on to the one interesting card in this. Let's move on to the one other interesting card in this particular sideboard, and it's gonna be the 1 copy of the Jaya Balrog. Now, just as I said earlier, just because you can see a single copy here doesn't mean that this had any impact on any of the game, or that this card is now gonna become a meta card. This is once again something you have to wait and see. It could simply be like the guy that made the deck just couldn't figure out what to put in the last slot in the sideboard and just threw in a Jaya Balrog just to have something. Again, don't take this as a sign that you should go ahead and craft a Jaya Balrog now to include in all your best of 3 mono red aggro decks. That would be a huge mistake. Anyway, that is gonna conclude this video. And as always, I see you guys tomorrow. This is Project signing out.